Barada, good morning, everybody. We've still got a few people joining us, so we're going to give it a minute and then we'll make a start. Okay, Barada pawb, good morning. Croeso ar ei sesiwn heddiw. Welcome to this morning's session. This is the first of a series of webinars that we're holding as part of our regulatory consultation event. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be giving you an overview of the Learner Engagement Code, how the conditions are going to work, the code itself, and what it might mean for your organisation. Today's event is a webinar, so don't worry, we can't see you. You can hopefully see and hear us okay. So you can carry on eating your breakfast if that's what you're doing in the background, but you can of course ask us questions. So you should see on your screen a Q&A button. If you click on that, you can post questions. Please do feel free to post questions in Welsh and English. We'll answer what we can today. Anything that we can't answer, we'll take away. This event is part of the consultation process. So any comments, questions that we have from you today, they will all feed into the development of the Learner Engagement Code. We're also recording today's session along with all of the other webinars and events that we're holding as part of the consultation. So we're going to put that up on our YouTube channel and circulate the link afterwards. So if you know of anybody who wasn't able to join us today, that there will be an opportunity to catch up afterwards. Our presenter today is Hannah Riley. Hannah works in my team in Medr, so my role is Head of Learner and Workforce Engagement. I should have started by introducing myself for those who don't know me. I'm Marion Jebb, so Hannah works alongside me in the Learner Engagement team, and she's responsible for leading on the development of the code. Quite a lot of you have probably already met Hannah. She's been doing quite extensive engagement since she joined us at the beginning of 2025. But I'm going to hand straight over to Hannah so she can introduce herself and she'll talk you through the draft code. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you, Marion. Bore da pawb. Good morning, everyone. As Marion said, my name's Hannah Riley. I'm the Senior Learner Engagement Manager at Medr and here to talk to you about the Learner Engagement Code this morning. I'm going to start by talking about the kind of context and background of the code just to set the scene. And then I'll talk you through how we've developed the draft that you see in the consultation pack, and then walk you through the code and the associated conditions of registration and funding before taking my slides down and having that opportunity to answer some of your questions as well. So the context of the Learner Engagement Code. The Tertiary Education and Research Wales Act, I won't be saying that too many times this morning, so I'll just call it the Act from now on, places a duty on Medr to develop the Learner Engagement Code about the involvement of learners in their providers' decision making. And I thought it might be a useful starting point to unpick some of that language and terminology now to explain what the Learner Engagement Code is and what it covers. So for the purposes of the Learner Engagement Code, when we're talking about learner engagement, we're referring to the opportunities for learners to participate in decision making with their provider. We're talking about ensuring learners are effectively represented in their provider's decision making, and also ensuring learners have opportunities to give their views on their education and matters that are of concern or interest to them. So we are talking about individual learner engagement. We're thinking about surveys, course or module evaluations, learners' direct engagement with staff members that they come into contact with, and other feedback mechanisms for individual learners, and really importantly, how that feedback is then used to shape and influence the provider's decision making. We're also talking about collective engagement of learners, whether that's through learner representatives, through students' unions where they exist, learner councils, and again, importantly, the roles that those opportunities have in working with the provider to understand learner feedback and to shape the provider's decision making. It's an important distinction at this point to say that when we're talking about learner engagement in the context of the code, we're not talking about learners' engagement in their own learning. So we're not talking about attendance, and we're not talking about how many questions they're asking in class and that kind of active engagement in learning. The learner engagement code is about engagement in decision making with providers. So what do we mean by decision making? The Act gives a really broad definition of decision making. We're talking about all decisions that are of concern or interest to learners. So we could be talking about decisions around the quality of their education. We could be talking about learners' classroom or learning experience, teaching and learning. We could also be talking about decisions around estates and resources, whether those resources are digital or physical, all the way up to providers' strategic decision making and how learners are involved in that. Of course, across those range of decisions and decision making processes, learners will be engaged in different ways and at different points. Importantly, there must be opportunities for learners to be involved and for their voices or their feedback to feed into that decision making at the most appropriate points and in the most appropriate ways. The Learner Engagement Code will apply across the whole tertiary sector. So the Learner Engagement Code will apply to further education, higher education, to apprenticeships of all levels, to adult community learning, and to school sixth forms as well. The way that it applies is slightly different in each part. So for registered providers, those that apply to be on Medr's register, the Learner Engagement Code has an associated condition of registration that you'll see as well in the consultation pack. For funded providers, which is the majority of further education providers, apprenticeship providers and adult community learning providers, there's an associated condition of funding. The condition of funding and the condition of registration are the same. They absolutely mirror each other. And you can find those in Annex B of the consultation pack as part of the regulatory framework. And that's to be kind of viewed alongside the Learner Engagement Code, which is Annex D of the pack. For sixth forms, the way the Learner Engagement Code is applied is slightly different. The Act places a statutory duty on the governing body of the school to comply with the requirements of the code. But the Learner Engagement Code does apply across the whole tertiary sector. So that's the kind of the background, the context, kind of the starting point of the code. As I said, I then wanted to talk you through how we've developed the code so far. And I guess my headline for that is that we've worked really collaboratively with the sector to develop the code. An initial set of principles that encompass the key aspects of effective learner engagement in decision making were developed even before Medr was born. Working with colleagues from Welsh Government and the Higher Education Funding Council, with learners and other sector stakeholders, those principles were developed, and we use those as our starting point when developing the Learner Engagement Code. We have engaged stakeholders individually and in groups, unpicking the wording of those principles and the meaning of them to form the requirements of the code that you see in the draft consultation pack today, and also building around those principles for the supporting information and guidance. We've worked with learners and their representative bodies such as NUS Cymru. We've worked with provider staff from all parts of the tertiary sector. We've also worked with representative groups such as Universities Wales, Coleg Cymru, the National Training Federation for Wales, and we've also worked with other organisations such as Learning Work Institute, Estyn and QAA. So we've really been doing lots of stakeholder engagement to form the Learner Engagement Code in a collaborative way, rather than me sitting in a room on my own and developing it. I also thought at this point it might be really useful to share what some of the feedback and some of the conversations that we've had along the way have been, and how that's helped us to shape the code. So just a few key points to share with you this morning. As I said, we started with those principles that we kind of underpin effective learner engagement. engagement code for staff. So it needed to be as accessible as possible. So we really needed to think about the language that we were using. And in having conversations about the language and the way that the principles were presented, it led to a suggestion of flipping the principles to be learner-centred, absolutely fitting with our strategic aim of focusing the tertiary sector around the needs of learners, and really focusing on their experience of engagement in decision making. And some have suggested, having seen the kind of learner-centred principles, that makes it easier to check in with learners, that the code is being followed, and to really understand their experience of learner engagement. Reflecting the diverse learners, providers and delivery types across the sector was always going to be a challenge. The principles approach is one way that we've kind of addressed this. So rather than being prescriptive about practice, we're focusing on the principles that underpin effective and impactful learner engagement. And that means that all providers can work with your learners and learner representatives, such as students' unions where they exist, to develop the most appropriate mechanisms for learner engagement, rather than us writing a list of all the things that you must do and trying to apply that across the whole tertiary sector. We've also built in examples to support the principles that reflect all parts of the sector, and we absolutely intend to build on those examples over time with further examples and case studies that start to bring learner engagement to life and help us all to share practice across the sector. During the development of the code, we've also started to pick up on common challenges across tertiary and within different parts of the sector. And what we've been able to do from that is already start funding projects with the National Union of Students and the Learning and Work Institute to develop support and good practice guidance in different parts of the sector. And again, that's something that we'll continue to do. And as we publish resources from those projects and outputs and have opportunities for networking and practice sharing, we will share that alongside the Learner Engagement Code on the Medr website for the whole sector to engage with. One of the biggest areas that we still need your input on is how we will monitor compliance with the code. We've started to have these conversations, and you will see that we have suggested how we may approach this in the consultation pack. Our aim is to draw on existing evidence wherever possible. We would rather you spend your time and efforts engaging learners in decision making rather than creating something new to tell us that you're doing that. So what we want to do during this consultation period and over the next few months or so, we want to build a picture of what you already have. What evidence could you already give us that demonstrates your impactful and effective learner engagement, before we get to the point where we're requesting that evidence, and as I say, hopefully not asking for something brand new for you to create. But we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to running through the code and the requirements and evidence monitoring section. So we have developed a draft learner engagement code. Let's have a look at what's within it. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to have a look at the draft code. As I said before, it is principles based rather than being prescriptive about the mechanisms for engagement. And those principles form the requirements of the code that all providers must comply with. Each principle is then supported by guidance and information. And the idea behind that is that it helps you consider the principles within your context, the context of your provider, your provision, and of course your different learners within each part of the sector. I mentioned the examples of practice before, and that our intention is absolutely to build on these. And what we've done is added those examples against each principle, again, to bring them to life and to help you to think about what that learner engagement might look like in your context. We've also included reflective questions for each principle, and that's to support the evaluation of your learner engagement. Not only is learner engagement being evaluated one of the principles of the code, you'll also need to evaluate your learner engagement in order to demonstrate to us its impact and effectiveness. And we hope that the reflective questions can help that process. And again, that's something that we can build on as the code becomes live and we start to work with you on it. We've linked resources, including good practice guidance, statutory guidance for different parts of the sector, and also Medr guidance as well. All of which, again, will build on over time. So we've talked about some of the projects we're already funding, and they will be resources coming from those projects that we will publish alongside the code, and it's something that we will continue to do in the future. Let's have a quick look at the principles themselves. I haven't shared the full text of each of the principles on the slide. I'm sure you can appreciate that would be rather a lot of information for a slide, but please do go and have a look at those in Annex D. Each of the principles has a heading or a title, a point of focus, and that's what I've shared here. And we'll run through each of those just to expand on it a little bit more and kind of give you an idea of what we intended each of the principles to cover and to kind of focus on. So our first principle is that learner engagement is embedded. So what we're thinking here is that learner engagement isn't a one-off opportunity for learners. It should be embedded in providers' decision-making processes and also across the learner journey, kind of creating that culture of learner engagement in decision-making. Learner engagement should be valued. Learners' feedback and engagement should be a valued part of decision making, where learners feel that they are supported and encouraged to engage, and everyone understands the benefits of learner engagement, again feeding into that idea that it's a culture of learner engagement rather than individual opportunities. Learner engagement should be understood, so learners should be aware of how and where they can engage and kind of what impact they can have if they do choose to engage with you in your decision making processes. To be inclusive, providers need to offer a range of opportunities for learners to engage in decision making, and also consider the potential barriers to engagement and think about ways of overcoming those barriers. Not all learners will be able to engage in decision making in one way, so offering a range of opportunities gives more chance for learners to be able to engage if they choose to do so. Learner engagement should be bilingual, so learners should have opportunities to engage in Welsh and English, and also to be involved in their providers' approaches to Welsh medium provision and promotion of the Welsh language and culture. And that principle is a direct link as well to our Welsh language condition of registration and funding that you will also see in the regulatory framework and also later on in this series of online webinars about the conditions. Learner engagement should be individual and collective, and that was kind of my starting point for the presentation as well in where we're talking about different types of learner engagement. So individual learners should have opportunities to engage in your decision making, and I highlighted some of those opportunities earlier where we're thinking about surveys, module feedback, direct engagement with staff. But learner engagement should also be collective, whether that's through learner representative roles, students' unions where they exist, learner councils, and as I said at the start, how those opportunities feed into the wider decision-making processes. It's really important that learner engagement is impactful. And what we're talking about in this principle is that learner engagement isn't just a transactional opportunity for feedback. Learner engagement is part of a cycle where learners can give their feedback, they can understand and have conversations with you about what's being done with that feedback. They can be a part of the actions that follow, and really importantly, to keep that feedback loop going when there are solutions or kind of responses to their feedback. They still get opportunities to feedback to you on, has that worked? Is there more to do? Can we do even more of this great thing that you've just created? So to continue that cycle so everybody can see the kind of impact and results of learner engagement rather than it just being a survey that they give and then they forget about the feedback they've shared with you. Learner engagement should be resourced. So to embed learner engagement across a provider's decision making, it must have associated resource, and that will look different across the sector and for different providers. It's an area that some parts of the sector may have specific guidance on. So for example, there's a piece of guidance that was a previous HEFCU circular on the funding for students' unions in HE. But when we're talking about resourced, we could be referring to staff roles or responsibilities within staff roles to make sure that learner engagement is happening and happening effectively. It could be about the funding of training and resources for learner representatives. It could be about spaces for engagement, whether they're physical kind of on-campus spaces or digital environments that make sure that learner engagement in decision making can happen. And finally, learner engagement should be evaluated. So providers and learners should work together to evaluate what's working well and what can be improved. And the Learner Engagement Code will also allow Medr to do this. So at a sector level, we can identify and share good practice. And we can also identify, as we've already started to do, identify what common challenges are so that we can fund support and guidance to help providers and the sector to improve learner engagement. I'll take a moment to have a breath. There was quite a lot to run through there. Moving on then to talk about the compliance requirements of the Learner Engagement Code. So the compliance requirements, again, are the same across the sector. They're set out in the conditions of registration and funding. You must comply with the requirements of the code, and those requirements are the principles, and also provide evidence of that compliance and the impact of your learner engagement. That's what we set out as the compliance requirements of the Learner Engagement Code. I'm going to move on to look at how we will monitor that compliance to help us unpick that a little bit more. So what we've set out in the draft condition and Learner Engagement Code is that on an annual basis, we will ask your governing body or equivalent to confirm your compliance with the code. And we'll do that through something that we call the annual assurance return. That covers more than just the Learner Engagement Code, and you'll see it across lots of the conditions of registration and funding. But it gives us an opportunity to have one place that brings things together, that asks you for that that kind of confirmation of compliance and requests for evidence and things. So that will be done on an annual basis. It's probably important at this point to point out that the first time we will do that for the Learner Engagement Code will be in autumn 2027. So when I said earlier that we want to have further conversations with you about what evidence we will ask for, we do have a little bit of time to do that and to work with you to establish what we're going to ask for in autumn 2027. So alongside that assurance from your governing body or equivalent, we'll ask for evidence of the impact of learner engagement. So we're not going to be looking for what you did or how you did it. I'm sure you'll tell us those things, but what we're really interested in alongside that is what impact did it have? So what impact did it have on the decision making? How did learners shape that decision making? And what impact did it have on learners and their experience? So that should include changes, as I say, made as a result of learner engagement, and evidence of learners' experience and perception of engagement. So that could be around what have learners said to you about their experience of being involved in some of those engagement opportunities. In terms of kind of telling us how you comply with the principles, we're not looking for individual statements on each of the principles or individual evidence for each of the principles. We're looking for a holistic overview of alignment. So looking at, again, that kind of culture of learner engagement and how your learner engagement opportunities align with those principles in a kind of a holistic way. As I kind of alluded to earlier, our intention is that the evidence is something that is already available to you, so not creating something new for this purpose. And we really want to have conversations about what you already have, and I've started to have some of those conversations with some of you as we've been kind of developing the code and in recent weeks as well. So that we can, when we get to autumn 2027, hopefully ask you for something that already exists that demonstrates your impactful and effective learner engagement. The annual assurance return and your kind of submission of evidence to us isn't the only way that we will monitor compliance with the code. In the background, we have access to lots of other information and evidence as well. So we'll look at that rather than asking you for it. So we will consider learner surveys. So for undergraduate higher education students, we will look at NSS outcomes, likely to be looking at the kind of questions around student voice and what that tells us about your learner engagement in decision making. We are also in the process of developing a national learner voice survey for other parts of the sector. We are just procuring an organisation to develop and pilot that with us. So we can tell you a little bit more about that in the coming months. We will also look at outcomes of ESTIN and QAA reviews, again, where that tells us something about your learner engagement in decision making. And where we're aware of complaints or trends in complaints data related to learner engagement, that might be something that prompts us to have a look or a conversation with you about what learner engagement looks like in your provider. And that leads me into kind of the final way that we will monitor compliance is through engagement with yourselves and your learners. So we will come and have conversations with you, ask you for kind of a chat about what learner engagement looks like for you, what you feel is working well, what areas you think you might need a little bit more support in, or kind of a look at what other people are doing. And we really want it to be that kind of supportive environment that drives improvement in learner engagement, so that we can improve it for all learners across the tertiary sector. Finally, I was just going to pop the consultation questions up on screen, just as a bit of a reminder of the things that we're asking you. And obviously you can respond to those through the formal consultation period, which closes on the 17th of December. We're also really happy for you to reach out to us if you don't manage to ask your questions today, or you think of something after the end of the call. But I'm hoping, I can't see the screen at the moment, but I'm hoping there's lots of questions that have flown into the Q&A box. And when I hand back over to Marion in a moment, we can start to answer some of those questions. So my final slide is just to share with you the learner engagement inbox in case you have any questions after the session today that you didn't manage to ask, and we would be happy to pick a conversation up with you. I'm sure we can share that inbox perhaps in Q&A or chat as well, so that you can see it. But I'm going to stop there and start to answer some of your questions, hopefully.
Thank you, Hannah. I don't know how to tell you this, but we've had no questions at all, which I am going to take as a sign that you've given such a completely comprehensive overview of the code and done so much engagement that people are reasonably clear on what's being proposed. We've got a couple that are just popping up now, so I think people are starting to ask questions about the actual involvement of learners themselves in the development of the code. And then we've got a question from Helen, which is about if a provider is making opportunities available for learner engagement, but learners aren't taking them up to a large extent, how would Medr view that? So, Hannah, tell us a bit about, yeah, I think you touched on it in your presentation, but can you say a bit about the work that you've been doing directly with learners to help inform the code's development?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, the initial kind of conversation about the principles and kind of the essential parts that underpin learner engagement that led to the principles we have now started before Medr and absolutely involved learners at that point. So there were learner focus groups to kind of identify the most important elements of effective learner engagement. So learner engagement started right back there. I can't give too much detail on that because I wasn't around then. But since I started Medr in January, I've kind of been working with stakeholders of all types across the sector to develop the learner engagement code. Specifically with learners, we've kind of tended to do that in focus groups, either reaching out to individual providers and setting up focus groups with groups of learners. And we've done that right across the sector for all different types of learners and provision, but also working with organisations such as NUS Cymru, where they already have existing networks and groups of learners that we could kind of tap into and have conversations, and popping along to their events and things, and having opportunities to talk to student reps in higher education and in further education, and their apprenticeship networks as well. And then the same working with Learning and Work Institute, where they've got existing networks and groups of learners that we've been able to reach out. And the types of conversations that we've been having, we started off right from, again, talking about what's really important about learner engagement. How do you know it's working well? What would they like to see from the learner engagement code, all the way up to sharing drafts of principles and later sharing drafts of different parts of the code to get that direct kind of feed in. And learners have absolutely shaped all parts of the code, have given us examples to kind of sit alongside some of the principles, and completely reshaped some of the principles as well. I think particularly the valued principle that talks about that cycle of learner engagement came directly from a group of, I think it was FE learners, who said it's really important that we don't let learner engagement just be transactional, and talked us through that cycle they wanted to see and helped us to build that principle. So yeah, that's how we've worked with learners so far, and that's absolutely ongoing. We've got some more sessions lined up now and in the new year.
Can you say a little bit, Hannah, about learners' take up of the opportunities for engagement they're offered? I think this is something that's come up a few times in discussions we've had with providers. So if a provider feels that it's offering all the opportunities, but maybe the take up from learners isn't that great, how would Medr view that in its monitoring of compliance?
Really simply, the learner engagement code is that providers must offer opportunities for learners to engage. We can't tell learners they must engage in decision making. But what I would always want to look at, if take up was low, we'd want to understand why. Is it because there were barriers to engagement? Is it because learners didn't know about opportunities? And sometimes that is the answer. It could be that barriers are there, or learners don't know how to engage in decision making, and the opportunities aren't right. Sometimes it's just that they don't want to engage in that particular opportunity. And that's where it comes back to me saying we need to have conversations. So it wouldn't be about Medr saying, your uptake is so low, you must be doing something wrong. It would be exploring with you how that opportunity could be shaped for your learners, to make sure that they actually do have the opportunity to engage. And then if they choose not to, that's absolutely fine. Not all learners are going to want to engage in decision making.
A couple of questions about adult community learning from Alice, and one of which I think is one we're going to have to take over. But let me give the first one. So again, I think this is something that we've discussed quite a bit. That the nature of adult community learning is that it's obviously delivered in community venues. There isn't necessarily a central structure, and it makes it difficult to bring learners together for forum type activities. Now, on a related note, Alison's also asking about the potential to use funding to reimburse learners for taking part in those types of activity. Can you just say a few words about our thinking in terms of that balance of what are our expectations? Do we need that collective bringing together, and the kind of the extent to which we can recognise some of the challenges around that, particularly for community-based learners?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where we recognise the learner engagement code applies across the whole of tertiary, and why we've taken that principles-based approach rather than being prescriptive about the mechanisms, because the mechanisms for adult community learners will look completely different to maybe a higher education student who is studying full-time on campus, and can engage in different ways. So There are opportunities, I think, even for adult community learning. A lot of their engagement may be individual. It might be the conversations they have with the staff that they see, and importantly, understanding how those conversations then feed into decision making and how that feedback is captured. But I do think there are opportunities for some collective engagement. You've got perhaps a whole class of learners might take 10 minutes at the beginning of the session to talk about what they think of the course so far, and have a little bit of a 10-minute discussion. That could come into that kind of focus group element. And I know we see this in different parts of the sector as well. If you're thinking about apprentices who may never come into contact with other learners and are predominantly in their workplace, engagement will look different. And I think what we need to do as we're developing those conversations about evidence and monitoring is really understand from you what your learner engagement looks like at the moment, and continue to talk to learners about what they value in terms of engagement and how that's working for them. So I think it's a very good question. I can't give you the precise answer on exactly what I would want your learner engagement to look like. Importantly, I think it has to work for you and your learners, so that it follows those principles, and that you can you can say that their feedback, their engagement is having an impact on their experience and on your decision making.
Thanks, and we're putting you through your paces now. Interesting question from Martin, who wants to know: is the code based on a deficit model that has existing practice that has not met the desired level? I think I know what you're going to say, but can you respond to that one?
Absolutely not. We know that in most cases, learner engagement is happening in so many different and amazing ways. But what we don't have at the moment is a way of capturing that, evidencing that, or even kind of, we certainly don't at a sector level have a way of evaluating that and saying, look at all the amazing things we're doing. In some instances, you're doing great things, but don't necessarily capture that you're doing it. And if we're not capturing it and we're not evaluating it, it makes it much harder to identify the elements that need a bit more support. And it makes it much harder to kind of drive improvement if we haven't got that kind of formal place to capture learner engagement. So no, it's absolutely not based on a deficit model. It's about capturing and kind of formalizing all the great things that are happening around learner engagement, and then working together as a sector to improve what already exists. And it might be about identifying some gaps as well, so that again we can work together and offer support to improve areas that need it a little bit more.
Yeah, and I've got a couple of questions about monitoring. I'm going to have a go at answering one of them, just to give you 2 minutes to have a quick breathe through and a sip of water. But Hannah, chip in if you want to add, or if you think I've missed the mark in trying to answer it. So Matthew's asked, do you think some kind of engagement will be valued more than others by regulators, e.g. a survey versus the forum? I'm glad you've asked, because it just gives me an opportunity to emphasise something that I think Hannah and I have talked about since the very beginning of looking at the learner engagement code, which is that we want the code and our monitoring of it to be focused on the impact of learner engagement. We are less interested in the detail of the mechanisms that you're using. So as Hannah's tried to capture in the draft code and has talked about in her presentation, there's obviously multiple different ways that you can do learner engagement with varying degrees of sophistication and formality. We've talked a bit about how different approaches might work for different types and groups of learners in different settings. What we are quite keen to avoid is having a load of evidence which is demonstrating that learners have been present when decisions have been made, but doesn't show us how their involvement has actually impacted on decision making. So forums are good, surveys are good, focus groups are good, governance is good, students' unions are good. They are all effective when done well, and they can all be the right thing for different settings and different circumstances. We don't have in mind any kind of hierarchy of this way is better than others, but I think it's important important to say that the way that we differentiate between learner voice and learner engagement, learner voice is getting the views of learners, learner engagement is actually including them in decision-making processes. So they are inextricably linked. They're all part of a process, that they are both important, but we don't see them as quite the same thing. To try and give you a brief answer, no, we're not looking to rank or rate the types of engagement that you're doing. We're trying to look at evidence of the effectiveness of how it's influenced your decision making. Hannah, how did I do? Do you want to add anything on that one?
No, fantastic. Nothing else to add to that.
Great,
thank you. Shall we pick up the question on the difference between the initial and ongoing
yes, please do.
condition? That I was just reading this one. So Helen has asked what the difference will be for this condition when looking at initial registration for those applying to Medr's register. The Learner Engagement Code condition of registration is an ongoing condition. Very simply, there are initial conditions of registration and ongoing conditions. The initial conditions are those that you need to demonstrate compliance with in order to get onto the register. The Learner Engagement Code is not one of those conditions. It is an ongoing condition of registration. The Learner Engagement Code does feature in the quality framework. So one of the pillars of the quality framework is learner engagement, and the code is a key part of that. Quality framework is an initial condition of registration, but we won't be at the point of kind of deep monitoring of the learner engagement code when you're applying. So that's more of a general across the quality framework at that point, and your kind of intent to comply with the learner engagement code. I'm hoping that I've given the right answer on that. Marion's nodding, so that's all good.
Sounds right to me. Question from Simon about monitoring. Can you clarify if compliance monitoring is based on the return or on Medr's own monitoring of ongoing evidence? And if it's the latter, how are we going to tell providers what items are part of that ongoing work? I think it's a sort of a mix of the two, actually. So fundamentally, we're going to be looking at the return. So there will be a headline annual assurance return, which will give us that high level assurance that providers consider themselves to have complied with the code, and we'll be looking at evidence to support that. So that is an annual event, a retrospective event through the annual assurance return. I don't think it displaces the need for dialogue and discussion with providers. So particularly where we might ask for more information, or we might identify good practice, or we might want to understand what's going on in more depth. I think there'll always be that iterative process and that room for discussion, and that could be on a provider level, or it could be more group network types of discussion where maybe there's emerging themes, areas where perhaps the sector might need more support or resources. So we're not looking to do some behind the scenes secret monitoring and spy on what you're doing and then catch you out for it. We are going to be focusing on that annual return as the key moment in the year where we're getting that information submitted by you. What I should mention is that we do talk to learners as well, and particularly where students' unions exist. So in HE and in some FE institutions, we do engage with those representative groups where those formal representative structures exist. So that gives us another element to monitoring, and it may be that gives us, as Estin would say, lines of inquiry or questions that we might want to ask about if we're getting a particular picture or story from an institution and then something different from student representatives. Then that might give us something that we want to follow up on, but we would expect that to happen by exception rather than a matter of course. Hannah, anything else to mention on that?
Only that the kind of final part of Simon's question there was kind of what's involved in that ongoing, and that's the kind of list that I ran through earlier of we would look at the outcomes of QAA and ESTIN inspections and reviews. We would look at complaints and complaints data that we're aware of, and the kind of conversations that Marion was touching on there as well. So a whole range of things, and that is set out in the learner engagement code, so you can see that that list as well, and it's listed on the condition of registration and funding.
Thank you, Hannah. Question from Eva, that this is an interesting one. Is the learner engagement code based on any examples of best practice from other tertiary systems that exist internationally? I think the short answer is probably we haven't looked very much at this yet, but Hannah, this is probably something we would want to explore going forward, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say it's not based on. We've certainly looked at what else exists in the kind of learner engagement space, whether that's in the UK or internationally. Certainly in terms of kind of the key things that underpin effective learner engagement, but we haven't done a kind of deep dive into, for example, the Australian system, looking at what they do around learner engagement and how that influences our code, but we're certainly aware of what's out there. But I think there's opportunities in the future across UK and maybe internationally to do some sharing of practice, and I think that's quite an exciting opportunity for us to look at.
Definitely some international study visits I
I
could
could
see in our
travel.
future. And then I think the last question that we've got lined up at the moment is from Freya, asking about time frame. If we're focusing on impact, but certain organisations' timeframes to make meaningful change could take longer, is there allowance for that? How would we view it?
Yeah, some things that you might be discussing with learners and students could take a number of years to kind of have tangible impact. We're not going to be looking at necessarily those individual examples and saying, oh, that's taking you a long time. We absolutely understand the process, and kind of we know that things can't change overnight. So I think what we're doing is we're taking a common sense approach, and we get the way that things work in the sector and how these kind of learner engagement opportunities work. So we're not setting, just like we're not setting exactly how you engage with your learners in decision making, we're not setting key timeframes. I think the important thing around that is that you are effectively communicating that with your learners. And if learners were particularly dissatisfied that things weren't changing because they didn't understand those processes, I think that's something we would be having conversations with you about, rather than not actually coming to a final result overnight. And
Yeah,
hopefully I've
absolutely.
articulated that properly.
There's quite a distinction here, which I hadn't really thought about before, but we probably do need to clarify it, Hannah, in terms of impact on the decisions versus impact of the actual thing that's happening. So as Freya points out, especially if it's a big strategic change or something like a new capital development, or some of those really big ticket things, of course, the actual impact on learners of that change could take months, years, or even longer to manifest itself. Of course, we're interested in that, but I think in the first instance, when we're talking about impact, we're talking about the shaping of the decision itself, not necessarily how the end game of that actually plays out. So I think that there's a lot of room there to be able to show, here's what we're doing as a result of the views that learners have expressed and the input that they've had. Here's maybe how we're changing and moving our approach, if it's something that, for example, has an ongoing working group or governance structures. Or I think all of that is good information and is very much the sort of evidence that we're looking for. We're not necessarily holding you to the impact that the change or development that you're doing has had over the long term, because of course that really could be a long game, couldn't it?
I think you made the important distinction at the start there. It's the impact on the decision rather than the impact of the decision. And yeah, let's have a look at how we've articulated that in the code itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that just about gets us to the end of the flow of questions that we've had coming in. So that's been really helpful. Thank you, everybody, for posing your questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, the questions, comments, views that people are expressing in this and the other stakeholder events that we're doing, it's all part of the consultation. We'll take it on board. The questions that you ask, give us a really good sense of maybe some of the areas that we need to refine or clarify in our the code itself, our guidance, our FAQs, and so on. So it's all feeding in, and it's really helpful. But of course, we're really keen that you submit formal responses to the consultation as well. So you've got the information on our webpage of how to do that. David's posted in the chat there that we've got other online webinars coming up that are about the other conditions as well. So if you've not seen those, you've got an opportunity to sign up for those too. And finally, Hannah did put our mailbox address on her last slide. So we're at learnerengagement@medr.cymru. So if anybody does want to come back with any specific thoughts, questions, concerns, you'd like a chat, please do that. We're more than happy to take those and have an informal conversation with you as well if there's something that needs a little bit more depth than we're able to get to in this type of event. So you've got a few different ways there of continuing to feed in your views and questions for us. Other than that, I think that brings us to a close. Thank you, Hannah, for taking us through and giving us such a comprehensive overview of the code and doing literally all of the work to get us to this stage. It's really helpful and very much appreciated. And we'll see some of you in future events quite soon, but please don't hesitate to get in touch if you think of something afterwards that you wish you'd asked, or as you're reading the draft code. Please do that. And thank you to everybody for your time attending today. Hope you found it helpful. Diolch yn fawr, and have a good week, everyone. Thank you.